building an inclusive technology ecosystem, promoting digital innovation by deepening dialogues on AI. Achieving shared prosperity, addressing global challenges. Energy transition, climate change, population decline, and pandemic responses. APEC-related events continuing in Seoul, the capital of the Republic of Korea, where diverse cultures blend. Jeju, the beautiful island, blessed with UNESCO Natural World Heritage Sites. Incheon, the vibrant international city, central hub connecting Asia-Pacific. Busan, the largest maritime city, centering around maritime trade and the logistics industry. And Gyeongju, the city hosting the APEC Economic Leaders Meeting, where 2,000 years of profound history and modern, trendy, and youthful energy blend in a perfect balance. Here, a new chapter of economic exchanges will unfold for a better future.
Welcome to the Globalist. Welcome to the Globalist. Welcome to the Globalist. We're in a new set, a brand new set.
I am a globalist. And I'm the globalist.
And I'm the globalist who wants to bring Jang right into your kitchen.
President Lee Jae-myung addressed South Korea's vision for energy and expanded his summit diplomacy at this year's G7 summit in Canada. Included in a total of 9 summits he held was one with Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba, and just in time for the two countries' 60th anniversary of normalizing relations. Despite an unconditional surrender demanded by U.S. President Donald Trump, Israeli explosions hammered the Iranian capital Tehran, entering the 6th day of the conflict. North Korea is sending at least 6,000 construction workers to help rebuild Russia's Kursk region in their latest military collaboration. South Korea called the move concerning and said it doesn't support the action. The Group of 7 summit in Canada has come to an end, with energy security and AI topping this year's discussions. There, President Lee Jae-myung also shared his country's vision and contribution and officially put South Korea's summit diplomacy back on track. Our top office correspondent Yoon Jung-min reports.
It was all smiles with a warm welcome in Kananaskis, Canada, as the Group of 7 began its expanded session with an official welcome and a group photo, with the notable absence of U.S. President Donald Trump. Invited were several guest countries, including South Korea, Australia, and India, for some crucial discussions.
For common problems in energy security, common opportunities in new technologies from information technologies, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, the need to have reliable supplies that this table can produce.
The new South Korean leader Lee Jae-myung took the opportunity on his debut on the global stage for multilateral summit diplomacy. His focus was on Korea's vision for diversifying energy, aiming to expand renewable energy and upgrade the country's power supply system at a time when there is more power demand due to the use of AI. Also addressed war security and critical minerals within the international framework and forging a global AI ecosystem, stressing Korea's role and contribution along the way.
Amid a major shift in global economic security, we have made clear our vision and role by actively taking part in discussing pending global issues. We have consolidated the status of the Republic of Korea as a G7+ country.
As Korea resumes its full-fledged diplomacy, the new president took the first step at the G7 summit, having unveiled Korea's visions for energy and AI. Now, many are watching whether more summit diplomacy would follow at the upcoming NATO summit next week. Yoon Jung-min, Arirang News, Calgary.
And Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy was also in Canada, but his trip ended up not being so fruitful, with no Trump meeting or a joint statement on the Ukraine war by the G7 members. Lee Seung-ja has more.
During the G7 summit in Canada, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy on Tuesday called on member nations to invest in Ukraine's defense technologies. The comments were made at the special G7 leaders meeting for Ukraine, where Zelenskyy shared details of Russia's missile and drone strikes targeting civilians in his country. The Ukrainian leader said Russia's upgrading of Iranian drones and its cooperation with North Korea is the reason Ukraine is actively working on the development of interceptor drones and why the country requires additional funding for their production. Zelenskyy also called for tougher sanctions on Russia, stressing that the EU's 18th sanctions package must reinforce restrictions on Russia's banking and energy sectors. He also called on G7 leaders to impose a strict price cap on Russian oil. During a meeting with Zelenskyy and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney on the same day, the Canadian leader announced that his country will provide Ukraine with a new military package worth more than $2 billion. Carney says the new military aid will give Ukraine drones, helicopters, and ammunition. Canada will also provide Ukraine with a $2.3 billion loan to help it rebuild public infrastructure destroyed by years of Russian bombing. Meanwhile, the Kremlin on Tuesday said U.S. President Donald Trump was right to say that it was wrong to remove Russia from the Group of 8 in 2014. The comments come as Trump said at the G7 summit on Monday that the G8 had been wrong to expel Russia after annexing Crimea from Ukraine. According to Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov, despite being expelled from the group, the G7 had lost practical significance for Russia and looked rather useless now. While the G7 summit takes place in Canada, Chinese President Xi Jinping held a summit with the leaders of 5 Central Asian countries on Tuesday. During the summit in Astana, Xi criticized Trump's tariff policy, saying that there are no winners in a tariff war. Xi said China and the 5 Central Asian countries of Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan will strengthen its cooperation as Beijing looks to further deepen cooperation on trade, energy, and infrastructure with the resource-rich region. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
So, South Korean President Lee Jae-myung is currently on his way back home after wrapping up his first overseas trip, attending the G7 summit over in Canada. To walk us through the key takeaways from his 3-day visit, we have our presidential office correspondent Song Yoo-jin here in the studio. It's good to see you, Yoo-jin.
Great to be here, Tommy.
So, Yoo-jin, the trip has come to an end, but wasn't there uncertainty at first over whether President Lee would attend the G7 summit at all?
You're right, Tommy. There was definitely a lot of speculation and questions, especially because this particular trip came just 12 days after President Lee took office, marking the fastest overseas debut for any South Korean president. Now, for your comparison, it took former President Yoon Suk-yeol 49 days, Moon Jae-in 51 days, and Park Geun-hye 70 days. Now, despite this tight timeline, President Lee did make the decision to attend. So here's what he told reporters aboard the Air Force One.
국제사회에 대한민국이 신속하게 정상화된다는 것을 좀 보여주는 게 필요하다라는 의견도 있었고 또 앞으로는 우리가 국제사회가 협력할 분야가 상당히 많은데 좀 무리하더라도 일찍 접촉하는 게 낫겠다는 의견들이 많아서
As you know, South Korea experienced a period of stalled diplomacy after former President Yoon's martial law debacle back in December.
Right. It was certainly a meaningful debut. Now, Yoo-jin, let's turn to the results. He did deliver remarks at the G7's expanded session, but much attention was on his bilateral meeting. So why don't we start with Tuesday's meeting with Japan?
Right, that was indeed the most anticipated one during President Lee's visit, especially after the planned summit with U.S. President Donald Trump was canceled because, as you know, President Trump decided to return early, citing the situation in the Middle East. However, President Lee did meet with Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba, marking their very first summit.
우리나라에서는 일본과 한국과의 관계를 가깝고도 먼 나라라고 고칭합니다. 마치 한마당을 같이 쓰는 이웃집처럼 우리는 뗄래야 뗄 수 없는 오늘을 계기로 한국과 일본이 미래지향적으로 좀 더 나은 관계로 발전하기를 진심으로 기대합니다.
I truly hope that marking the 60th anniversary of normalized diplomatic ties, exchanges will grow not just between our two governments and businesses, but also between our people. I look forward to Korea and Japan working together in a way that contributes more to the region and to the world.
So during this 30-minute meeting, the leaders reaffirmed their commitment to regular summit-level meetings while also agreeing to strengthening trilateral coordination with the United States, particularly in responding to regional geopolitical challenges, including North Korea. A senior presidential office official told reporters the talks were held in a positive, friendly atmosphere, and both leaders expressed interest in frequent reciprocal visits.
Now, aside from Japan, with Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba on Tuesday, President Lee also made sure to sit down with other world leaders, right?
Right. So on Tuesday alone, President Lee held bilateral meetings with 6 other heads of state, plus UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Now, among the G7 members, he met with UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney.
The leaders of South Korea and the UK agreed to move forward on updating their post-Brexit FTA. They also discussed working together on Korean Peninsula, peace and security.
And in his summit with Canadian Prime Minister Carney, Yi emphasized defense cooperation, specifically mentioning the participation of Korean companies in Canada's submarine acquisition program, with contracts expected to be finalized by 2028. President Yi also held summits with the leaders of Brazil, Mexico, India, and the European Union, where economic cooperation was high on the agenda.
But Eugene, President Lee Jae-myung's summit diplomacy actually began on Monday on the first day of the three-day visit, right?
Right. So President Yi actually kicked off his visit to Canada by holding a bilateral meeting with two world leaders. First, the President of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, and Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, which also focused on economic and security cooperation. Now, throughout his bilateral meetings with a total of 9 heads of state, the presidential office says that President Yi prioritized building personal rapport and also pragmatic diplomacy.
President Yi engaged comfortably with all the leaders, drawing on his prior knowledge of their personal backgrounds, political careers, and governing philosophies, while also using his trademark humor to build rapport.
In virtually every bilateral meeting, there were focused discussions on advancing practical cooperation in areas like trade, investment, supply chains, and energy, aimed at delivering real benefits for the Korean economy and businesses.
Well, it certainly does seem like a strong start, but there's still a pending task left, a meeting with U.S. President Donald Trump. Eugene, any updates on when that could happen?
Well, that is, as of now, the big question, because a lot of people put focus on whether President Yi would meet President Donald Trump, because the looming deadline for the 25% reciprocal tariffs by the Trump administration on South Korea is approaching fast. However, the talks apparently, as you know, did not realize. So according to a senior top office official, talks are currently ongoing to arrange a meeting at another multilateral engagement. One possibility is next week's NATO summit, but President Yi's attendance hasn't been confirmed yet.
Well, Eugene, we're going to have to get back to you once that happens in the near future. Thank you so much for coming in today.
My pleasure.
The Middle East conflict intensifies as Israel and Iran exchange strikes on the 6th consecutive day. Our Yoon-hee has the latest.
A new wave of strikes has shaken cities in both Israel and Iran as the conflict between the two countries enters its 6th day. U.S. President Donald Trump on Tuesday called for Iran's unconditional surrender, declaring that the U.S. now holds complete and total control of the skies over Iran. He also said that Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, is an easy target and that America's patience is wearing thin. Not backing down, Iran's supreme leader posted on social media early Wednesday, declaring to Israel that the battle begins. Following his warning to Iran, the U.S. president held a National Security Council meeting in Washington after abruptly leaving the G7 summit a day early on Monday. The White House has yet to provide an official statement following the 80-minute meeting, but CNN reports that officials familiar with the discussions say Trump is weighing options and growing more open to using U.S. military assets to strike Iranian nuclear facilities, and that he spoke by phone with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Amid the possibility of change in Trump's approach, sources say he is still open to a diplomatic solution if Iran is willing to make concessions. According to Reuters, meanwhile, fighter aircraft have been deployed to the Middle East already, although U.S. military officials have emphasized their defensive nature. So far, Washington's involvement in the conflict has remained defensive, supporting Israel by helping intercept Iranian missile attacks. The pressing question is whether the United States will intervene in the Israel-Iran conflict with military support or push for a diplomatic resolution as civilians flee and the death toll continues to rise. According to Iranian state media, more than 220 people have been killed since Israel began bombing Iran on Friday. Iranian attacks on Israel have resulted in at least 24 deaths. Yoon-hee, Arirang News.
North Korea is dispatching at least 6,000 military personnel to Russia so that they can help rebuild a Russian city damaged by its war with Ukraine. The deployment marks a new phase in Pyongyang's deepening partnership with Moscow, and it's drawing concerns from Seoul. Our Kim Jong-sil reports.
North Korea is sending thousands of military construction workers to Russia's Kursk region, including 5,000 construction workers to rebuild damaged infrastructure and 1,000 sappers to clear the area of landmines. The decision was announced by Russia's top security official Sergei Shoigu after he met with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang on Tuesday afternoon, their second meeting in just 2 weeks.
It's a gesture of brotherly support from the North Korean people and their leader, Kim Jong-un.
North Korea is believed to have already sent some 12,000 combat troops to Russia's Kursk region since October. South Korean intelligence says around 600 have been killed, with total casualties nearing 4,700. Analysts say Pyongyang's support isn't without strings, and it's likely expecting a payoff.
North Korea will likely get advanced systems like the Pantsir air defense weapon and reconnaissance satellite technology.
Professor Kim added that Pyongyang will also likely receive oil and food supplies in return, crucial support as it struggles under sanctions and isolation. Other analysts say the visit also reflects shared concerns over Washington's recent signals regarding the situation in the Middle East.
With Trump doubling down on saying Iran must never get nuclear weapons, Russia may be reassuring North Korea, which has taken real risks for Moscow and still wants full recognition as a nuclear power.
Pyongyang gave no details on the new deployment, but said the two sides exchanged views on global and regional issues and reached full consensus. A South Korean presidential office official on Wednesday called the deployment concerning and said Seoul does not support it. Earlier, the foreign ministry said the employment of North Korean workers abroad violates UN Security Council resolutions and called on Pyongyang and Moscow to halt their cooperation. Kim Jong-sil, Arirang News.
For the first time under the Yi administration, South Korea, the U.S. and Japan held combined air drills on Wednesday morning in waters off the southern part of Jeju Island. This also marked the first joint air drill since January. 2 South Korea's F-15K fighter jets, 6 U.S. F-16s, and 2 Japanese F-2s participated. The drills were conducted to boost trilateral security cooperation to deter North Korea's advancing nuclear missile threats, the Air Force said, and added that it plans to continue three-way drills on the back of a firm Seoul-Washington alliance. The government and the ruling Democratic Party have finalized a coordination on a supplementary budget plan, agreeing to provide cash payments to all citizens while offering additional support to vulnerable groups. Our Moon Ji-young has more.
Expected to exceed 20 trillion won or $14.6 billion, the government and the ruling party have finalized the details of their supplementary budget. This comes after the National Assembly passed the first extra budget of 13.8 trillion won last month, which included about 400 billion won for vouchers to support small merchants. Representative Jin Sung-jun, the DP's chief policymaker, announced the details after a policy meeting with officials from the Democratic Party, the Ministry of Economy and Finance, and the presidential office on Wednesday morning. Jin stated that consumer vouchers for livelihood recovery will go to all citizens, with additional assistance to low-income and vulnerable groups. He also mentioned that the extra budget plan follows the principle of universal relief and reflects President Lee Jae-myung's determination to provide additional support for vulnerable groups.
An expansionary fiscal policy is fundamental in times of crisis. We urge the government to formulate a bolder and more proactive supplementary budget plan.
DP officials stated they would actively adjust the debt of small business owners incurred since COVID-19, announcing that a budget for debt relief has been reflected in the plan. They also decided to issue more local currency to boost consumption within regions. Furthermore, the government decided on a revenue correction, revising the budget based on the forecast of lower tax revenue than expected last year. Upon President Lee's return on Thursday from the G7 meeting, if he holds a cabinet meeting to review and approve the supplementary budget containing these details, the National Assembly will then commence a full-scale review of the plan. 문지영, Arirang News.
Cheonggyecheon is one of Seoul's most iconic urban streams that becomes a nice rest area, especially during the hot summertime. But it wasn't this welcoming or comforting 20 years ago. Our Park Kwon-woo tells us more.
With daytime temperatures soaring past 30 degrees Celsius, people in Seoul are doing all they can to stay cool, from carrying sun umbrellas to clutching icy drinks. And for many, it's the perfect weather to enjoy the water or even get right in. And there's a special place that's drawing big crowds, the upper part of Cheonggyecheon, temporarily open to the public to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the stream's restoration. Laughter echoed as children and adults splashed, kicked up water, and even waded through stronger currents for fun. International tourists were also spotted easily, cooling off and snapping photos.
Living in somewhat of a big city, you don't normally get to see really lovely streams like this, especially when it's so hot and humid. Kind of refreshing to be able to step in the water. It was a lot of fun.
But for Seoulites, Cheonggyecheon isn't just for play. It also offers a peaceful escape from the heat.
It's been so hot lately, but by the stream, it feels cool. So it's a great place to rest. I often like coming out here for some fresh air, especially as sitting all day at work feels stuffy.
That comfort is the result of a remarkable transformation that began 2 decades ago.
Cheonggyecheon was once hidden under concrete during Korea's industrial boom. Restoring it raised environmental concerns, but now it's clean enough for native fish and birds to thrive. A true case of urban ecological revival.
In fact, the stream is home to around 20 native fish species, including the Korean spotted barbel, which only survives in grade 2 or cleaner water. And that's thanks to regular water and bacteria tests conducted to maintain quality. Beyond ecosystem revival, the stream is widely recognized as a successful model of urban water management, offering more than just eco-friendly value.
Cheonggyecheon helps lower the surrounding temperatures raised by heat-absorbing pavement like asphalt, and even improves air quality, acting like an air conditioner for the city.
Seoul now plans to transform more than 300 kilometers of streams running through the city into vibrant, accessible waterfront parks just like Cheonggyecheon. And as the city moves toward a more water-sensitive future, Cheonggyecheon stands as a reminder that even in the heart of a big city, nature can make a peaceful comeback. Park Kwon-woo, Arirang News.
The summer heat is getting stronger and stronger all over the country. Today, the daytime temperature in Seoul rose up to 31 degrees Celsius, and it will rise to 32 degrees tomorrow. Please take care not to get any heat-related illnesses under such hot conditions. The rainy season will begin in inland areas in the second half of the week. It will rain in the central parts of the country and Jeollabuk-do province from tomorrow night. Heavy rain is forecast across the country on Friday. Up to 80 millimeters of rain is expected in northern parts of Gyeonggi-do province and northern parts of Gangwon-do province, and 10 to 60 millimeters in other regions. Tomorrow morning, Seoul and Jeju will start off at 22 degrees, Chuncheon at 18 degrees. Highs will move up to 32 degrees in Seoul and Daejeon, 34 degrees in Gyeongju. Rain in the central parts of the country will continue until the weekend. That's all for Korea. Here are the weather conditions around the world.
That is all we have for tonight. I'm Kim Dami, and for all of us here at Arirang, thanks for watching and good night.
저희가 매일매일 자동차를 타고 일상생활에서도 쉽게 사용을 하는데 그런 자동차에서 타이어는 계속해서 버려지고 있거든요. 전 세계적으로 10억 개 이상 버려지고 있는데 특히 소각 처리될 경우에는 대기오염 물질들이 여러 가지가 나오게 되고 매립됐을 때는 지하수나 토양오염 물질들이 많이 방출되게 됩니다. 저희는 그런 타이어들을 어떻게 잘 처리할지 좀 고민을 했었습니다. 타이어가 가지고 있는 접지력이나 내마모성이 좀 우수하다고 생각을 했고요. 저희는 타이어 하나로 신발을 3.5켤레 정도를 만들 수가 있어요. 그렇게 됐을 때 저희의 신발 한 켤레는 타이어에서 발생되는 탄소를 8.9kg 정도 저감할 수 있는 그런 효과가 있습니다. 이 일을 시작하기 전에는 타이어가 그렇게 많이 버려지는지도 몰랐고 그리고 버려진 타이어들이 환경 파괴적으로 처분되는 것도 사실은 잘은 몰랐어요. 점점 더 적체가 되고 있거든요, 타이어들이. 시간이 지나면 지날수록 더 큰 문제가 될 것 같다는 생각에 지금 일을 하고 있습니다. 타이어마다 모양이나 패턴이 굉장히 많이 다양한데 내가 가지고 있는 신발이 다른 신발들과 모양이 다를 수 있다는 점, 그런 점도 그 재미 요소로 좀 다가가고 있습니다. 저희도 그런 계기를 보다 많은 분들께 하나 더 제공해 주고자 매일매일 신는 신발을 만들겠다고 한 것도 있어요. 조금 더 주변을 살펴보면은 나 스스로도 조금 더 환경 보호에 참여할 수 있는 일이나 물건들이 더 있지 않을까, 그렇게 찾아보시면 어떨까 싶습니다. 나는 다시 달릴 수 있게 만드는 그리너입니다.
Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mo-gyan. South Korean President Lee Jae-myung has returned from his two-day visit to Canada, where he attended the G7 summit as a guest, marking not only his first overseas trip since taking office, but also his official debut on the global diplomatic stage. The visit, grounded in what Lee calls a national interest-based pragmatic diplomacy, included back-to-back summits with leaders from 9 countries and a brief meeting with the UN Secretary General. Most notably, Lee sat down with Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba for the first Korea-Japan summit under his leadership, just in time for the 60th anniversary of the normalization of ties between the two countries. However, the much-anticipated summit with U.S. President Donald Trump was postponed due to Trump's emergency return to Washington. All eyes are now on what comes next for Korea's summit diplomacy. To delve deeper into this, we connect to Hannah Kim, Associate Professor at Seoul University GSIS. Welcome, Professor.
Thanks for having me again.
And also joining us is Daniel Connolly, Associate Professor of International Relations at Korea University of Foreign Studies. A big welcome.
Thank you for inviting me.
So let's start a discussion with Professor Kim. Like I've said, President Lee Jae-myung's debut on the global stage. He's now returned from his first ever appearance at the G7, and the presidential office called it a restart of high-level diplomacy that had long been stalled. So from a pragmatic diplomacy standpoint, how do you assess the significance of his presence at the summit?
Yes, in many ways, President Lee Jae-myung's presence in the G7 summit, along with the bilateral meetings that took place, hold quite a bit of significance because it really did signal to the international community that South Korea's summit diplomacy has been restored after a tumultuous 6 months. So the chain of events that followed President Yoon's martial law was highly unusual and it drew global attention. So inevitably, South Korea's summit diplomacy was put on hold during this time. So from this perspective, President Lee's attendance itself served as a critical turning point by demonstrating that South Korea had returned to the global diplomatic stage. And even National Security Advisor Ri Sung-rak commented that I think of just a few days ago on June 15th that President Lee's appearance marked the first international stage to show that South Korea has overcome its democratic crisis and that democratic Korea is now back. But that being said, one disappointing aspect of all of this was the cancellation of the U.S. ROC summit. A bilateral meeting was originally scheduled for this morning, but President Trump abruptly returned to the U.S., citing the situation in the Middle East, which led to the meeting being called off. And even though the South Korean side did express understanding, to a certain extent, it can still be viewed as a diplomatic discourtesy. And so because of this, from South Korea's perspective, it did what it can to restart diplomacy, but there were some external events that prevented the full ability for a lot of different types of summits.
So there were a lot of ups and downs. Lee's presence at the G7 definitely seems to set the tone for how Korea intends to, re-engage globally. Now, one of the notable outcomes from the G7 was President Lee's meeting with Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba. Professor Connolly, it was the first Korea-Japan summit under the Lee administration, and remarkably, one of the earliest such meetings by any incoming Korean president. How do you view the significance of this bilateral encounter?
Oh, I definitely think it was a very kind of crucial test of President Lee's summit diplomacy, because to some extent, the Yoon administration had really built up a very strong trilateral cooperation with Japan. And this was strongly supported by the United States. So he kind of stepped into this situation where it's impossible to stop this trilateral cooperation. He has to keep momentum without sacrificing Korean interests. And I think the meeting they had today, or at the G7, was a very good example of how Lee managed to use the right kind of language, talking about future-oriented partnerships, really demonstrated that South Korea is a reliable partner to Japan and, by extension, the United States. I think this is reflecting an attempt to make a two-track approach where the historical issues are put on one side and maybe a more future-oriented, focusing on business and commercial challenges in the region. But I do think, though, there's still a problem in the future, that trilateral cooperation, there's a fundamental divide between the United States and Japan, who envision it much more of a regional approach, especially against China, maybe even against Russia, whereas the ROK is much more focused on keeping it oriented towards North Korea. So I think moving forward, President Lee has to deal with this deviation of interests between the three sides of trilateral cooperation.
Right, so further discussions would be necessary while keeping the momentum under the new administration. Now, adding to that, the presidential office emphasized that this meeting may help create a pathway for resolving historical disputes a little bit more smoothly. Professor Kim, from here on forward, what kind of approach do you think should the Lee administration take in steering Korea-Japan relations?
I think Professor Connolly mentioned, the importance of this because, in many ways, President Lee Jae-myung is going to be trying to, or he has been envisioning this so-called two-track approach where he's trying to treat historical issues and present-day cooperation separately. And I also think this aligns well with President Lee's pragmatic leadership style, which emphasizes practical solutions over ideological rigidity. But as Professor Connolly mentioned, it's not really clear how long this is going to actually last. From previous more progressive administrations, we saw that there were diplomatic frictions between, the Democratic administration in South Korea, along with the Prime Minister in Japan, and this was very visible during the Moon Jae-in administration as well. So in many ways, I think President Lee has to navigate not trying to avoid these frictions, but also trying to pursue some of these things that did take place during the former President Yoon Suk-yeol's administration. For example, trying to potentially pursue trilateral cooperation again. It's very unlikely that something like Camp David summit will take place, but he does have a very clear line that he needs to walk in order to avoid a lot of the mistakes that previous administrations have made.
So there seems to be a little bit of hope that this early diplomacy might ease some of the long-standing friction between the two countries, but that's depends on how it will be managed moving forward. Now let's switch our focus a little bit to Washington. A highly anticipated meeting between President Donald Trump didn't actually materialize. We had a lot of things to discuss. Some had hoped it could open the door to, new trade talks in Korea and the U.S. Realistically, Professor Connolly, when do you think we might be able to see that first summit between President Lee and President Trump?
Now I would say maybe the earliest window would be the NATO summit on June 24th and June 25th. The problem is, though, is President Lee hasn't made any concrete announcements that he plans to attend the summit. There have been some rumors, but I think that's the next possible window. And for example, the Australian Prime Minister, he's already trying to reschedule his one-on-one meeting with President Trump at the NATO summit. So I strongly expect perhaps there may be some discussions going on right now with the Lee administration of doing the same. Because the deadline for the tariffs is June 8th, so there's not a lot of time to cut a deal.
Right, definitely. Time is ticking. We'll have to make a decision really fast. Now, even though the delay in the summit is quite disappointing for many, some people argue that President Trump's focus on broader global priorities might ultimately benefit South Korea. Professor Connolly, what diplomatic impact do you see from this postponement?
Right. On one hand, it was a little bit of a blessing in disguise. Trump did not appear to be in a mood to make any compromises or concessions at this year's G7 meeting. Even with the host Canada, he kind of made a promise to establish a trade deal in the next 30 days, but he kept making comments like, I have a tariff concept or I'm a tariff person. So there seemed to be a very kind of strong reluctance to cut any deals. The same thing with the Japanese prime minister. He flew back without any tariff deal as well. So I think on one hand, this gives the Lee administration more time to prepare their negotiations. President Trump is also infamous for being very changeable, so maybe he may become more lenient as the deadline approaches. But I'm a little cautious to call a crisis in the Middle East as an opportunity for South Korea, because a war in the Persian Gulf could have profound impacts on the region. Right? 20 million barrels of oil go through the Persian Gulf. If that gets interrupted, I think all of East Asia, Japan, China, and Korea are going to have serious economic fallout. So I would say it's a two-edged sword missing the summit with Trump.
Thank you for explaining for us both sides of the situation. Now, turning to the broader strategic landscape, Professor Kim, over the past few years, the G7 has taken a consistent stance on curbing China's influence. And as President Lee continues to emphasize pragmatic diplomacy, how should South Korea position itself between competing interests of two big powers, U.S. and China?
It's very difficult for Korea to position itself, and I think Korea is always kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place when it comes to positioning itself between the United States and China. And even until recently, the G7 did not always take a hardline stance against China. For example, at the 2023 G7 summit, the member states issued a relatively friendly joint statement that sought to contain China while still leaving room for cooperation. At that summit, President Biden actually expressed optimism that there may be a thaw in U.S.-China relations that would occur very shortly. And the United States sent a series of high-level officials to Beijing to manage the competition between the two countries within a controlled framework. And so rather than opting for decoupling, the G7 leaders adopted a de-risking strategy during that time, which was aimed to reduce their dependency on China while maintaining avenues for cooperation. But then in the 2024 G7 summit, we saw that there was a much tougher and more comprehensive statement on China. And there was a 36-page communique where China was mentioned 28 times. And the G7 started to strongly criticize Beijing for supporting Russia's war in Ukraine and for its various unfair trade practices. So this showed that the G7's position on China had shifted within a very short period of time. So now with President Trump back in office, many G7 countries are experiencing friction with the United States on a number of fronts. And under these conditions, it may be increasingly difficult for the G7 to present a unified front against China. So this could actually provide President Lee Jae-myung with more diplomatic flexibility and room to pursue a more pragmatic foreign policy, as he has been emphasizing, towards the U.S. and China. And in such an environment, it might be possible for President Lee to even emphasize South Korea's role as a constructive bridge builder that engages with both sides, where national interests align while avoiding more rigid alignment with one side.
Now, as Professor Kim touched upon the G7 again, let's delve deeper into that. Even though Korea is not really a formal G7 member, President Lee attended this summit as an invited participant. And there he even proposed the idea of a potential G7 plus. Professor Connolly, do you believe that this visit effectively communicated Korea's readiness to engage and contribute to the G7's global agenda?
Oh, yes, definitely. And maybe building on what Professor Kim just said, I think the G7 is experiencing a little bit of a crisis right now. And this crisis creates an opportunity for South Korea, but the same opportunity can also be a challenge. So, for example, Canada, the host nation this year for the G7, really emphasized that they wanted to engage with partners beyond the G7. They emphasized building coalitions with reliable partners who have common values. And South Korea really demonstrated this role well, I believe. They showed up, showed themselves to be a responsible actor with lots of economic, technology, defense kind of goods that they can provide to this organization. And this, I believe, is exactly what Canada and the Europeans were looking for, this kind of reliable middle power that can carry its own weight. But at the same time, this kind of lack of US leadership that's creating new roles for South Korea to show its place in the world is also means that the G7 is weaker than ever before. So there was not even an attempt to make a full joint declaration. Trump left early. He even insulted Macron when he left, repeatedly mentioned that Russia should actually be part of the G8 like it used to be. So I think South Korea is kind of invited to a party, but the party already has some serious problems. And the G7 has always had a legitimacy problem. It only represents 10% of the world's population. So I do think that this sort of G7 plus idea can be very important for South Korea to make the framework more inclusive and less of an exclusive club of rich, powerful states.
So this idea of a G7 plus certainly sent a message to member states as well. Now, President Lee Jae-myung spoke twice during the G7's expanded sessions, focusing first on energy security and critical mineral supply chains, and then on the link between AI and energy demand. Professor Kim, he outlined Korea's plans to lead in both areas, including through the Mineral Security Partnership and AI semiconductor development. Do you think these proposals will translate into real cooperation with other nations?
I do think it's possible that these proposals could translate into real cooperation. They are relevant and they align well with the values and interests of the global community. As Professor Connolly mentioned, this was mentioned during the G7 summit several times. But in order for this to actually turn into cooperation, it needs to be very clear whether South Korea is going to be viewed and acknowledged as a global leader through its technological strength. In many ways, South Korea can be viewed as at the forefront of advancements related to semiconductors and battery technology. So in this sense, South Korea may have an edge. The proposals are also timely and credible given Korea's technological base. Additionally, Korea is seen as a capable and non-threatening partner by most major players, which makes it an ideal collaborator in areas that require high trust and multilateral coordination. But at the same time, there are going to be many limitations that can't be overlooked. And from the international perspective, the US-China rivalry will continue to affect these discussions. And some countries may be hesitant to work with Korea if Korea appears to be closely tied or allied to one bloc. And from a domestic perspective, Korea needs to back its proposals with domestic investments, which may take time and effort. And as we've seen over the past 6 months, South Korea domestically still has a lot to handle at this time. And also, in addition to that, there are many countries that are trying to lead in AI and semiconductor development, including Japan, Germany, and the United States. So without a clear reason as to why South Korea should lead in these fields, these overlapping agendas are going to increase competition, and that's going to dilute the willingness for stronger cooperation among a lot of these countries. There are definitely there's potential, but there are also some limitations as well.
So we'll have to see how these ambitions would be realized in the future. Now, before we conclude our discussion tonight, Professor Kim, we talked about NATO a little bit a while ago. It will be held on June 24th and the June 25th, and President Lee is reportedly leaning towards attending. It's not fixed yet, though. If he does, what should we be paying attention to from the standpoint of pragmatic diplomacy?
I think Professor Connolly mentioned this earlier as well, but even in the G7 summit, President Lee Jae-myung participated in the G7 summit just 12 days after his inaugurations. And he himself acknowledged during a press conference that attending a major international summit so soon after taking office is clearly a challenge. And he considered not attending because there are so many domestic issues that await his attention right now. But he chose to attend, and part of the reason why was to hold the meeting with President Trump, which didn't happen. But it was important because of the upcoming bilateral tariff negotiations. So right now, I think it's very crucial for President Lee to meet with President Trump ahead of that deadline. And so it's very likely that President Lee will seek to attend the upcoming NATO summit as an alternative venue for these talks. I think this is one of the more pressing international issues that he needs to face. So hopefully we can see meaningful discussions take place soon so that the US-Korea tariff agreement can be concluded in a mutually satisfactory way, because a diplomatic breakthrough on this issue would not only ease a lot of economic uncertainty that we're seeing in Korea right now, but also demonstrate the effectiveness of his pragmatic diplomacy on an international stage.
So President Lee's possible attendance could be another chance to elevate Korea's profile, as well as hold discussions on the tariff issue that many have been waiting on, and we'll be sure to keep tabs on that. Thank you so much for your time and for your insights tonight, Professor Kim and Professor Connolly. We appreciate it so much.
Thank you.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.
도시는 세계와 연결되어 문화를 창조했고 새로운 것을 받아들였다.
자유,
융합,